Hello everyone, I'm Ed Faulkner, and I'm really happy to be here today with all of you. I was very excited to hear when this conference was just an idea at Baltimore. I think part of what's exciting about it is this is definitely a self-selected cutting-edge group, right? People who were willing to go off into the unpathed wilderness and cut new ways. And so it's great to have that audience here together to share all those things they found out there in the wilderness. And this is really talking about how do you take those paths people have been cutting through the wilderness and pave superhighways over them so that everybody can do this stuff. And so we can go move on to the next frontier, right? That's how we push software forward. That's how we push our communities forward. So this is really a talk about, how do we make software easier to make? That's the big question generally when you talk about software. And the first answer is generally you don't, right? Like, there's some well-known fundamental reasons software is hard to write. And you can only fit so much complexity per brain. And if you try to add more brains, you add more and more communication links. And this is the no silver bullet kind of problem. This has been well understood since 1986 at least. And it's basically just been an ongoing fact of life. If you write software, you realize something's just hard. And you don't have a magical way to make software simple. But there is the one known workaround, right, which is building on higher abstractions. So, you can only keep track of so many facts as a developer. You can only know so many things at one time. And so it matters a great deal that you have the ability to call an abstraction that just does what you want, right? Solve my problem is the ideal program, right? Or maybe not needing a program at all, because somebody else already wrote it for you. That's the only way you actually get where you're going faster, is if you have large chunks of problem ready to go. Now, to take a less silly example, you can think about something like the web working group fetch spec, which is now implemented in pretty much all modern browsers. A line like fetch this URL, right? It's just as magical as my solve my problem line, right? Think about the complexity in that abstraction. It's going to deal with URL parsing specs, and it's going to deal with DNS requests, and it's going to deal with the network layer 7 layers down. And you're talking to machines who knows where, right? And their operating systems and their network stacks. And it's crazy, right? If you had to actually fetch that page from first principles, that doesn't even compute. It's not even something anyone could do. Right? And so, of course, we know this when we work in software. We know abstractions are the only way we get anything done. So, abstractions are magic, right? They are the things that you don't have to understand. They're incantations that you can just take for granted. And that's part of what's fun and amazing about making software. Like, we just have to know the right magic words and things happen. And, as you get really into software, you craft some new spells. Of course, one of the complaints that you sometimes hear about a particular abstraction is that it's too much magic, right? People get a bad sense or have a bad time sometimes, and they say, I don't like that it's too much magic. I want to do it myself. I want to get down to the middle. And of course, it's not really that there's too much magic, because if you think about it, it's magic all the way down. There is, so much complexity down the stack that there's not a single human in the world who understands it all. And one of the things for beginners in software that I like to, when I address more beginner audiences, to emphasize that a lot of people don't get until they've been doing this for a while. Being good at software really requires being comfortable living in a little sea of knowledge surrounded by a little island of knowledge surrounded by a vast sea of things you don't understand. And being comfortable that you'll be able to learn them on the fly if you need to. And that's really the art of functioning in software, in software ecosystems. So it's not about too much magic. There's plenty of magic. It's more a question. So when people say too much magic, they typically mean the abstraction is not a good abstraction. It either doesn't actually match the problem they're trying to solve, or it matches but it leaks very badly, and the stuff that's supposed to be abstracted away keeps sneaking out, and you have to learn about it, and you didn't want to learn about it. Those are the things that make somebody complain about an abstraction. So too much abstraction is not really a relevant question. Good or bad abstraction is definitely a relevant question. And good abstractions are hard. The reason they're hard is because we have an extremely limited budget for interface complexity. What I mean by that is, to use an abstraction, you've got to understand it from the outside. You have to understand its interface. And the budget for doing that, the amount of complexity you can handle, is limited by our brains, right? There's just so far you can go until we've all got cybernetic chips implanted. There's only so much there. It doesn't scale. Whereas implementation complexity, it's still limited, but it's limited by the capital investments of everybody who cares about solving the same problem you do. And so that could become unbounded. And that's the great trick of open source communities like Drupal's and many others, is that we have this massive investment of many, many person years effort into making abstractions that are actually solid, that actually don't leak much of the time, that actually match the problem domains of many different people. So Drupal is like a canonically great example of what I mean when I say build higher on higher abstractions. And this audience knows why that's a good idea, because you are here at a Drupal conference, right? You see the value. You can build higher, faster, farther together. And those abstractions are only good because a very large set of people have contributed to them. Both because of the nitty-gritty time and effort it takes to make an abstraction solid, but also because just inventing abstractions necessarily requires a community. Because if you're only solving your problem, you haven't abstracted it yet. It's not abstract, it's one problem, right? You need a whole family of problems before you actually have good abstractions. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of community building, it takes a lot of consensus, which is stuff that is easy to overlook when you're head down in the code, but makes an incredible difference over the long run. So that's partly why I'm excited always to get involved with the Drupal community, because it has a long track record of doing that. Now, I spend most of my time working with folks in the Ember community, in JavaScript land, and in other tangential and other related JavaScript framework land. The open web platform has really come of age as a true application runtime, right? And that wasn't really true 10 years ago, or maybe even 5 years ago. But now it really is very practical to treat the web as an operating system, as a runtime for shipping real applications. And what I mean by that is ones that actually run distributed, right in browsers. Obviously, you're here at a Decoupled conference. I don't think I need to make the sales pitch too hard that JavaScript apps are a thing. Some places you still have to make that pitch, but people are basically accepting it now. Gmail is pretty old now, and that was really one of the big aha ones that made people realize how much you could do on the web. But of course, that gets us back to the idea of cutting paths in the wilderness, right? Like writing Gmail back when Google first did it was a very hard problem, right? It was something you only could take on if you were that team with those kind of resources, because you did everything from scratch, and they wrote compilers and everything, right? That difficulty curve is ramping down, and so it went from extremely hard to now it is merely difficult. And that's really why you see a kind of Cambrian explosion of frameworks out in JavaScript land. And that's because the purpose of frameworks, at least the way I think of them, is that frameworks are really where we're trying to work out as communities what is going to be the next general purpose set of abstractions that eventually everyone will take for granted and stop even thinking about. Right? The same way that you can just say fetch that URL and not think about it, there's going to be more layers. We're going to lay down more layers going forward into the future of abstractions. They don't really become layers that we can forget about and just take for granted until they're really, really solid. They can't be solid until a whole community's worked on them. And so frameworks are really kind of candidates for those future worlds, right? You get enough people to buy in on saying, let's try out this future world. That actually gives you enough critical mass to work on maybe making it reality. So there's been incredible progress and growth in JavaScript framework land. When you try to survey the scene, you can really lay out different projects on a continuum, from the smaller, simpler things with less features to the bigger, more complex things with more features. And Drupal's pretty high up on the ambitious, big, complex, broad user base end, right? And other kind of Drupal peer projects are somewhere out there too. I think Drupal is like one of the most featureful and most ambitious of them. That's why I put it way at the end. But you look at kind of JavaScript land, everything's much, much farther down in the lower features, narrower user bases, smaller, simpler. And here they're actually kind of spread out because they cover a very wide range, from from the React, and you could go even further down if you want to go to the Preacts and the Infernos and those things that are just micro libraries that do only one thing, and they're very, very far from a practical application. Gradually growing up the stack to much more complete tool sets like Angular. Ember is probably the most opinionated among the JavaScript frameworks. That has always been the badge of pride in the Ember community, is that we want it to be more featureful. But that still leaves a pretty big gap, right? Between Ember and WordPress here, where do we fill in that hole, right? And why does the hole matter? Right? Well, the hole matters because it's just really difficult and expensive still to ship apps that truly take advantage of the open web platform, right? The idea that if you were going to donate a weekend to go set up a website for your children's school, should you build it in Angular or Ember, or should you build it in WordPress or Drupal, right? I think it's pretty clear you should go to WordPress or Drupal still. And that's great, and that's why these projects are still thriving. But we want to also gradually build up the abstractions so that even those use cases can take advantage of all the cool things that you already want to do, which is why you're building decoupled apps, right? So we want to bring everybody else along and let a whole explosion of software come out of that. And that's, again, how we draw more people into these projects to work on the frameworks, build the next layer of future abstractions. I'm going to also throw in here Glimmer, which is not as well known because it's very new, but it's actually not that new a code base. It was extracted out of Ember. It is Ember's own super low-level layer that's basically at React level complexity. And I'm going to probably use the word Glimmer, and I wanted to make sure I put it in context here. It's Ember's rendering layer. So, and I'm here also to talk about Cardstack, which is the project that I'm spending most of my open source time on lately. And Cardstack is intended to help close that gap between building up as far as Ember and going all the way to something featureful like Drupal. And I drew it here with 3 other logos in the box because Cardstack's not trying to rule your world. It doesn't want to own any of your data. It's intended to fuse existing things that you've got. And Drupal is one of the first class things that it can use as its data store, along with things like Postgres or Git. Or, because it's designed around not having one canonical source of data that it must own, it's extremely good at fusing all your weird, arbitrary enterprise systems, which is a pretty critical use case. So let's talk a little bit about what the philosophy is here and why I'm building this thing, myself and some other folks who I'll introduce. So, the first principle is that we embrace HTML, and that's pretty foundational to the web. It's important because of a couple things. But one is that it's at the right level of power for making things on the web. And doing everything in, say, JavaScript or any other fully currently programming language is just, it's not focused enough for the kind of things you want to do with HTML. And the set of people who can wield HTML is way broader than the set of people who can wield JavaScript. So making as many things as possible through understanding of HTML enhanced with templating is important, and it's how we're going to be broad. We build on top of Ember, and we picked Ember because it's the most opinionated and has the most shared code already. We really want to have comprehensive ecosystem, and there's a very deep add-on ecosystem in Ember that we can build on top of and bring all into existence. So basically bootstrap a whole ecosystem right away. And as I said, it coexists with the data sources you already have. So this is a different way of thinking about a integrated application. There's not, like, Cardstack doesn't have the Cardstack database. Right? There's no, it has state, but that state is throwaway and caches, and all the canonical states are elsewhere. So I'm going to take you through, not a tutorial, but an example of what it looks like to go from basically nothing to a site that can use Cardstack. And I'm going to do it by building a contenta. Do you guys say it as contenta? Is that how you pronounce it? Yeah. Okay, good. I've only ever read it on the web. Yeah. So for those who don't know, contenta is a relatively new Drupal distribution that's very focused on the headless case, on API first case, and it's very well put together, and I highly recommend you check it out. And one of the things that was very nice about the way folks put together contenta is it ships with a out-of-the-box site that actually has content and schema and some nice stuff in it. so that you can immediately begin to get a sense for things. And because it has that, people have been able to write a whole series of different front ends showcasing different frameworks and different strategies, all against the same content of Drupal. So it makes a lot of sense to do one for Cardstack, and that's what I have done. And so, if we were starting from scratch, and if I'm assuming here, because this is not a tutorial, this is really just to give you the flavor, that you've already got Ember, the command line tool installed, Ember CLI. So Ember new contenta, Cardstack is what we're going to call it. Ember serve starts up the Ember server, and on your web browser you see this. And this is what any Ember app that you started would show you. So great, we've got an Ember app. There's nothing Cardstack specific about it yet. So the next thing we would do is we would add these 3 plugins. Now, there's 3 of them because this is an extremely modular system, and I know everybody claims their code is modular. I'm going to claim it too. But I will back it up and say that all of these things can work by themselves, and that part of the whole way that we're getting growth in the Cardstack ecosystem is the fact that these things tend to be useful. Each of them is useful on its own, particularly for all the folks who already have Ember apps and want to add a little bit of this functionality in. So it's a gradual adoption story. We're going to build out and basically use a lot of the pieces, but I'm going to focus one small bite at a time so we don't get overwhelmed. So I'm going to add these 3 plugins, and I need to set one setting, which is I need to put my Drupal site's URL in. Right? And so after I do that, I still have the same looking site, but if I open up the Ember Inspector, which is a Chrome plugin that any Ember developer would use, I can see here that I've actually got a whole bunch of models already defined for me. Right? Now, where did these come from? These are actually all the content types in the contenta default site. So, like this recipe model here is one defined in contenta. There's a couple other ones here that came as defaults out of the box for Cardstack as well. So, okay, that's kind of exciting, but what can I do with these? So, next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to, in my application, I'm starting with one template at the top of my application. Application.hbs is what you call it in an Ember app. And I'm going to paste in this little snippet of template. And so that you could get a feeling, again, this isn't a tutorial, we're not going to go into super detail on syntax, but you get a feeling for, like, this is not that complicated. We can learn how this works. The one thing you'll see recurring here is that the pound sign and the backslash really are intended to evoke, they're kind of like open and close tags, right? And in fact, in newer Glimmer syntax, they will literally just be web component syntax with angle brackets. But anyway, let's build a query for type recipes, and let's build a list of them. And so now when we look at our site, we've got an actual list of recipes. And I can actually go and explore the models that I was able to get, see all their content. And so what I've got here are actual, this Ember app already understands the schema of this Drupal. It discovered it using OpenAPI endpoints. It can crawl those endpoints for the schema. It can map which content types go to which endpoints. It actually does it correctly even if you remap them using the JSON API extras. So there's definitely some bugs that we're going to want to work on to make it really robust. There's a little bit of duct tape to fix over the bugs. But each case I had to duct tape. I filed a bug and I put a URL in the code next to the duct tape, and they can all come out and it will then be pristine. And they're small things, very small things. So cool. So we've got a list of recipes. Let's add another plugin, the rendering plugin. The point of the rendering plugin is to give you this Cardstack content component. Right? So this is a component-driven system, and that's probably not a radical stretch for anybody who's seen React, Angular, Ember, Vue. Any of these systems have very much centered on a component-driven way of thinking about the world. Cardstack search is a component. Cardstack content is a component, and I'm passing in a recipe, and I'm saying please render as a card. Right? And then I get this lovely list all saying no such component. So I need to tell it how I want this component to look. So I'm going to paste in this template. The thing to get a feel for here is that it's just HTML that you already understand, plus a little bit of templating. And all I'm really saying is I want the title here, I want the prep time there, and I'm going to follow these links all the way down to the image URL there. So now, when I render it, I actually have cards of recipes. Now, stop and consider, I haven't written any JavaScript yet. Right? Pretty good. I've been able to do this all from an HTML-like template language, just by pointing it at my Drupal. So here in the little video, I'm making it easier to see more of them by spreading them out. And let's keep going. So let's see. So let's now, just to show that the Cardstack search I'm running here is not some kind of hard-coded thing, and to talk about some of the features of Cardstack, I'm going to extend the query that we're passing into the Cardstack search by tying it directly to a user input. Right? So I've created an input field at the top, and I've sent it into the query that I'm running. So now I have an input box at the top, and if I put stuff in, my search is going to update live. And this is a actual full-text search with word analysis and all that done on the server. We should talk about what server that is I'm talking about. We haven't stopped talking about architecture yet. But it's not just doing the kind of basic like string matching. It's actually analyzing words and doing relevance and all of that. It's powered under the hood with Elasticsearch, which is a very solid, robust, full-featured, mature foundation for doing this kind of stuff. Cardstack is very much a search-first way of thinking about building applications. You know, often if you begin without being kind of search-driven, if you're constructing very specific structured queries for every aspect of your site, eventually you tend to reach breaking points where you get to a feature that's hard, right? Maybe that is personalizing content for everybody. Maybe that's doing a more holistic balancing between freshness and relevance. All these kind of things that get really hard to do if you start out with very rigid kind of querying. Those problems are way easier if you start out with a fully powered search engine under all your stuff. When you want to do something simple, the search engine can do the simple things too, but it can also grow to do the rich things. So every search, every query is really fully search engine driven. Now we're going to talk about adding some client-side routing. So we're going to add the Cardstack routing package, and I'm going to move that template we were looking at into a new place. And the reason I'm moving to new place is I'm going to delegate my entire app's routing to this plugin. And so everything it's rendering is actually a piece of content, and our homepage is also a piece of content if I needed to move my template there. So I'm going to, now the only change I'm going to make, other than moving the file, is I'm going to make my recipe cards that we'd already created earlier, I'm going to give them a link now using this Cardstack URL helper. So now, the cards that I had before I still have, but now they're active links, and they go to a new route. And every piece of content that is accessible based on access control has a route. Just as anything on the web that's a good citizen of the web should have a URL, and it should be a canonical URL. When I get there, of course, I don't have a component for that, so let's make one. Here's, again, a very simple template. You can see it's really only got 3 dynamic things in it, and it's just a bunch of HTML. So now I can navigate to that page, and I've got a detail page for my recipes. Okay, so a lot of the folks working on decoupled stuff tend to only do read-only, and then they do their editing elsewhere. I don't think that's the way to go in the future. I think we want apps that are holistic experiences. So let's go and actually begin editing our content directly from the app. Right? So the first thing I'm going to add is the Drupal auth plugin. And what it gives me is a component called Drupal login that I can drop wherever I want. If you just call it like Drupal login, you get literally a link that says login. And when somebody clicks it, they get the login behavior. But this is an opportunity to show you how we can compose markup in arbitrary ways. If you want to control the markup, you invoke a component instead of in the top one here is just in simple form. The bottom version we call a block form. Right? We're going to pass a block of HTML into that component. And the component is giving us a login action. And then we can render whatever HTML we want. So in that case, the component says nothing about our markup. It's providing pure behavior. And that gives us full control over our markup still, which means we can actually compose a theme plugin with a login plugin. Neither needs to know anything about the other. We can simply get our login action out of the Drupal login component, and then invoke some kind of theme components button, a theme plugins button component here if we wanted that. So, and before I make this, to see this button actually do anything, I'm also going to add the Cardstack tools plugin. And I've added a little more markup here as we go, as you'll see. Some more CSS just to make it pretty. So, and I've put my Drupal login button up in the top right there. There's a login button. When I click it, it's going to take me to the OAuth authorization client grant flow at Contenta. I can authorize the client to say, yes, I would like this app to have access to my stuff. And after I'm logged in, I now have the Cardstack tools activator button up in the right that brings in the Cardstack tools. So what you're seeing here is the Cardstack tools know about my templates, right? Because they were Cardstack templates. Right at compile time, we knew where all the fields go, and so we can find them and show you them in context. The users can interact with them. There's a couple different examples in here, and then if I hit update, that just wrote all the way back to Drupal. So here's a video of a slightly more complex editing scenario, just to show off a couple more of the features of how, if you've got a lot of the features turned on a site, the kind of things you can do. So, and it's got some pretty silly content, but you can see some examples here of a narrative container that's actually got inline images and videos and stuff. This particular field is a mobile doc fact field. Mobile doc is a great portable format for this kind of stuff. You may have noticed that there's an editor on-off at the top, and that's kind of an important conceptual UX aspect of this framework, which is that most navigation, whether you're editing or visiting, can all be the same. When an editor navigates the content the same way a visitor does, right? If they want to find something, they can go to the search page and find it. If they want to follow a link, they just follow it. And then when they want to edit, they flip that switch, right? Because the basic thing is to know, if I'm clicking on something, am I interacting with it, or am I actually following the link like the user would? That's what that switch is important for. So this is showing off some of the media management that it can do. Making a new post. This is a picture of my son Arthur. He just learned to color. I recorded this a while back, so he's been coloring a while. This is going to show that we can actually see the content in its different formats. We can do card format, we can do larger card formats, hero format, and we can customize the media for each of those. So here we're going to pan and zoom to make our card be way more hard-hitting with that kid face looking at you. And editing is still a possible right place on the card form too. So this is really giving that editor the ability to see their. It's a balance between structured content and WYSIWYG. Right? This is not pure WYSIWYG, because that can lead to madness. It's structured content, which is part of the pitch of Drupal in the first place, right? Is to have structured content. It's a balance between structure, which is why we have so many fields and things going on in the properties panel on the right-hand side, and in context on the left-hand side. Those two things together are really what we're going for here in terms of trying to think about the UX, the best UX you can do once you have these kind of tools. And so we're creating a hero version of this piece of content. Save it. And I think the last thing we're going to do here, please go to the next, where we actually are going to go and enable this for the home page and publish it. And we'll see it as the hero card on the homepage. There we go. We turn off our tools, and now we're just seeing our product. Okay. So here's some references. Actually, so the second one I probably haven't made public yet. I'll do that right after I finish speaking. Mostly because I was just feverishly editing it while I was preparing this talk. So the top repo is a much more interesting one, because that's where all of the work has been going on in the Cardstack framework. And I'd like to give a shout out quick to two other folks who are here who contributed. Aaron, please wave and say hi. Aaron Sykes and Chris C. back here. I wanted to point them out because I'm not going to actually be here tomorrow, tonight, into the rest of the day. These guys will. So if you can't find me, definitely picture them and find them and talk to them more about it. But I'd also be happy to answer any questions. While we're all around, definitely over lunch. Let me put up my contact info again. the base overall state of this is that there are real projects built on it. It's definitely still young enough that there's no documentation, and you should really come get involved with the group if you want to be helping out and trying it out. But we're definitely looking for people who are interested in being able to take advantage of this stuff. Often, there's usually just a small gap for your particular project in what we've got that is way easier to close than it would be to try to build all this up from the bottom. And that's the whole point. That takes us back to the point of my whole topic, which is let's build higher together. Let's not reinvent the wheel, and let's invest in community shared abstractions. And let's pave the paths that could be, the next Drupal could be all of this, right? This is all open source components. Any number of them could become part of Drupal. And that would be fantastic, and that would bring all this capability to every Drupal user. And so with that, I will wrap it up. And I guess am I a little early or am I a little late? Do I have time for questions?
Yeah, about 10 minutes.
Oh, 10 minutes, okay. Well, I could just give you a break, or we could do the questions. Yes?
Hi, good talk.
Thank you.
What about server-side rendering?
Sure, good question. So what about server-side rendering? Yes. So Ember supports server-side rendering pretty much out of the box. Emberfastfood.com. So this site will tell you exactly how to do it. The whole add-on ecosystem is basically on board, and so just about everything works. And if any add-on that doesn't, they got a PR or an issue with you. And so all of that does server-side rendering. Oh, I should actually, I should totally talk more about a little bit of the details of the architecture here, because I glossed over it. And I even have a backup slide for that fact. So yes, server-side rendering is definitely a thing, and this all works. The way the Ember fast food architecture is basically the idea that you're going to boot up your Ember app in Node, right, so that you can render it on a server. Critically, it is still at arm's length from all your data sources, right? It's running the same way it would run in the browser, it's just on a different place. And so when it boots up to render on the server, it's still going to talk to your API data sources, which in this case is going to be Drupal. So whether it's rendering on the server or on the client, it's going to speak exactly the same to your backend data sources, get that data, render it out the same, and then serve it up to the user. So it's really it's a transparent optimization that doesn't put requirements on how you structure your overall architecture, beyond just being a fairly normal Ember app. So I knew I should end it early, and that's because I realized I put my architecture slide at the end after the credit. So obviously, a lot of the stuff I'm showing you needs some server-side stuff that is more than just Drupal. And so there's a server called Cardstack Hub, and that's why we added that plugin. And when I ran Ember Serve, which is the standard way any Ember app does development, if you've got the Cardstack Hub server around, it runs it automatically for you. It's a node-based server, and it has a well-typed plugin architecture. There's a bunch of different kinds of features you can add to it. I call it well-typed plugin architecture to distinguish it from a lot of other kinds of examples of systems where everything's a plugin, but they basically every plugin has full reign over anything. We tried to make it much easier to write plugins and for them to coexist by making them well-typed. What I mean by that is you implement a plugin of a particular type, like a data source plugin, like the Cardstack Drupal plugin is a data source plugin. And it can do basically three kinds of things. It can index content out of a data source, it can write content to the data source, or it can do basically searches, remote searches into the data source if you didn't want to index it. The Drupal auth plugin is an authentication plugin. That's another kind. It's got a specific API, and as long as you implement those hooks, any site should be able to authenticate with you. And these things compose. You can use Drupal as your authentication source, and then have data coming from other systems too, and basically let users in Drupal and their permissions dictate who can access other things on other APIs, or vice versa. You can have content coming from Drupal and have your users coming from a third-party authorization service or something like that. So that's a little bit about the plugin architecture. This shows examples of some of the kinds of backends where you might store your data, and Drupal is one of the very first ones we implemented. SQL, we have a pretty good Postgres plugin right now. Git itself as a storage mechanism is quite powerful, and I didn't go into that in the demos here, but if you're interested in workflow and editorial workflow and preview, these are very powerful things you can do if you choose Git as your storage for your content, because we can do full branching on the site, so that people have a drop down and they can choose which branch they are seeing and working on, and then propose those changes to Git versions of the main site. Right? That's kind of a nice thing, particularly in the early life of a project, when all the data and the code and the config are all living together and evolving quickly. Obviously, we know how to use, as developers, we know how to use Git to do that. And exposing just a little bit of that power, surfacing it to everybody who's involved with the site, so that they can immediately begin adding content and changing configuration as the code is evolving, is a very powerful thing. The hub uses Elasticsearch internally as its own fast, low latency cache. It indexes and denormalizes all the data sources you give it, so that you can do really low latency stuff, independent of how fast your backends are. So in a sense, Cardstack Hub is designed to take quite a lot of load in front of your data sources. So you could, it's one way to scale up and defend a Drupal that you didn't want to invest in making extremely beefy for a traffic crash. And legacy business systems is in here because this whole hub thing grew out of multiple projects for actual clients who always, of course, have complicated data needs. And the application you really want to build needs data from a lot of different systems. And that's just true of any organization beyond a certain size that I've ever seen. So designing this from the bottom up so that you could get your interesting data in there was part of the point. And so all of this grew out of real projects, and we were able to extract in open source. And so this all fits into kind of an idea for what is a good architecture for the future look like, and I think this is a powerful one. I do think that having a server process that acts as the kind of front-end fusion search index layer with your canonical data sources behind it is a very powerful way to go. You typically find it needs to do the auth, because that's kind of one of the unifying principles. So there's a pretty good grant system here in the hub, so that the hub can understand who can do what, and you can grant permissions to things that are fine-grained way. And yeah, so once you have these kind of architectures out there, new exciting vistas kind of open up. Part of the ulterior motive in building this whole system is to actually re-decentralize the web and to empower people in a way that kind of very centralized monolithic web applications don't do today. A system like this makes it easy enough to drop in small slices of functionality that are complete. Right? If you think about the fact that you can write a plugin for this architecture that has components on the client in the browser, their own microservices in the hub. We have a Docker-based setup so that you can depend on anything you need to depend on without worrying anybody who's deploying this stuff. Right? If you want to pull in whatever the best server-side thing you want, say for example, you want a real-time messaging layer. Well, we're working on a Matrix plugin for it so that you will have a distributed real-time messaging layer. And there will be no new burden of knowing how to configure that thing or even what language it's written in, because Docker can take that away from us. Do you have a question?
So, for the people that we are dying to try this and start playing with it, how hard it is to get these in front of myself? Like,
sure. So, how hard is it to get running? It's not. We can totally get it running today on your machine. And I need to write down a doc, and we should sit down heads together and do it the first time, and we'll totally get it going. And then we can write down it for everybody else how we did it. But this stuff is real, and I will. I'll open up that repo, make sure all my changes are pushed, and I very much wish I was going to be around tomorrow, and I'm not. But I will totally be accessible online to help people who are excited about trying it out. And we will definitely make it possible.
That was the first question.
Sure.
Then, assuming that you could have the schemas in all of these backends that you're putting here, would it be possible to start with one of these and then say, okay, now we used Git because we wanted to use all these features, but now we're actually moving into Drupal, so migrate all the content to there.
Right.
Would that be possible?
Yeah, I do think it's possible. This is a good strategy for migrations, yes. In particular, the data source plugins are pretty much required to hide a lot of their own details from the rest of the system. So all of the front-end code that you might make, or at least the templates, right? We didn't really write any JavaScript in this. But obviously you can and you will if you want to extend things and make new field editor plugins and all that kind of good stuff. But like all of that stuff doesn't really know about what data source the data is coming from. The lingua franca is JSON API, right? And so if you, in fact, there was a slight thing I didn't go into detail on the talk, which is that I actually had two data sources going. Basically because there was just a bit of configuration of Cardstack code itself I wanted to store somewhere, and I didn't want to actually depend on making schema changes to the standard contenta. So I needed a place to stick other stuff. So I threw in one, just the Cardstack ephemeral data source, which is nice at testing, and it's great for like automated test suites. Lets you have a fully featured data source that then just is easy to reset to a pristine state and make it go away. So the front end couldn't tell which data content came from which, right? So that's pretty good. You definitely, I mean, there's nothing out of the box to do the migration for you. And I think that there's a couple of places in the architecture we do want to like reserve that feature possibility. Right? Like one would be making sure that a single content type could actually get split across two data sources. We think that should be possible. And if you fetch one and edit it and send it back, it should go back to the right place. Right? They should carry enough metadata with them. And I think they do already. So yeah. Ted?
What's the biggest pain with working with Drupal with something like this? Like, what would make better?
Sure. So the question was, what's the biggest pain with doing something like this with Drupal? That set has gotten so much smaller in the 2 years that I've been playing with these things. So first of all, kudos to everybody in that whole initiative to make it better, because it has gotten way better. I mean, honestly, right now the cutting edge stuff where there's a lot of bugs is this complete discovery based off of schemas, right? It's just new and not very thoroughly exercised yet. I don't think a lot of people are doing it yet, and so there's definitely stuff to fix and bugs there. But that's because it's now with the frontier. And the things that I would have said a year ago were around auth and around configuring of the REST module, and all that stuff is solved. So the set is getting smaller and it's moving out on the frontier. Mostly around the discovery stuff now. And yeah, I mean, nothing else is really sticking out.
What about validation as far as like when you validate your saving stuff?
Yes, good question. Validation. So that is an area where that touches to the schema discovery I was referring to. There's definitely things that people will validate that are not reflected in the schemas yet, so I can't necessarily discover them. Cardstack does have a solid way to represent all those constraints so that people know about them, and people implementing field editor plugins in the browser can know about the constraints too, so that they can give the user early warning that their stuff's not valid. Yeah, I mean, right now there's only the most basic stuff that we can get out of the schema to know, but I do think extending the schema discovery stuff is probably the way to go with that. And there's good open standards already for representing much of this stuff. So that's a really big deal, because coming up with those standard abstractions is a lot of work and it's hard. And the fact that there are some pretty well thought out ones out there is a big step already for us. Yeah. Yes.
Is Cardstack relying on a cache, or is it always passing through to?
Sure. So is Cardstack relying on cache? It's definitely relying on cache. And that's what Elasticsearch is really there for. Basically all reads try to go to Elasticsearch first, and for the vast majority of cases, like the way I have the Drupal data source plugin set up, it just indexes everything it has access to. It all goes into Elasticsearch, and from that point forward, reads are coming out of Elasticsearch. There is, there's a polling to catch changes that were coming from Drupal and get them into the cache. We can totally do a Drupal indexer plugin to push them faster. And when we do writes all the way through the Drupal, we know to go round trip, and we index our own writes. That's an important principle in a caching system like this. We don't write to our own cache and trust it, not knowing how those changes really round trip all the way through the data sources. So when you write through the hub, we write all the way back to Drupal, and then we index that, and then we serve that back out. So you have a true kind of fail-safe round trip. But yes, like pure reads can come all out of Elasticsearch, and Elasticsearch is great for that. It's designed to be low latency, and so it can be very fast, even when you're doing complicated queries. And part of that comes from, in JSON API parlance, a lot of how you would optimize your data access is by having good default includes for each of your models, so that so that you're not going to just fetch a recipe and then go fetch and then see that it refers to an image and then fetch the image and then see the image refers to a file and fetch the file. You want to get them all in one hit, right? And so by being able to configure default includes in JSON API, which is JSON API module, it has good include support. We can do the same thing when we cache everything in Elasticsearch, so that it's a single document read that's already got all the denormalized stuff in it. So it's optimized for that. Okay. All right, I think I'm out of time. So thanks everybody, and I'm happy to answer any more questions as we go through the day. Thanks.